Welcome back. We are continuing our Python series. And as we indicated earlier in the previous session, we now want to have a look at control structures. Now, as you will recall, a control structure is a command or a statement that allows us to determine the order in which commands are going to be executed within our main program, and also by extension within our functions. By default, the instructions or the commands are going to be executed in sequence. But if we want to change that, then we have our selection commands, which are our if statements or conditionals. And if we want to repeat stuff, then we also have our loop statements. So we will have a look at the if statement quickly and then follow that with the for. Sorry, with the loop. So let's get cracking. I'm going to create two variables. So num1 is equal to 10 and num2 is equal to 20. We're now going to set up a command that allows us to compare these two. So let's say if num1 is equal to num2, colon, and then let's say print formatted string, they are equal. And let's execute this and see what happens. So I can get rid of to get some more space. I just get rid of the things above the main and let's execute. And we're not seeing any output. And we assume that we're not seeing any output because 10 is not equal to 20. So num1 is not equal to num2. So let us check if they are not equal. And we'll see what happens. So we have just checked to see if they are not equal. And we are seeing that the message has been displayed. But now we need to change the message so to they are not equal. Because the message here was saying that they are equal. Remember, we were testing for equality first. So seeing that we have changed the comparison, we now need to change the statement. So we execute, and we are seeing that the message says they are not equal, which is to be expected because 10 in num1 is not equal to 20 in num2. So that is how we set up our basic if statement. And this is what we call the single if, because it tells us what to do when the command is true, but it does not tell us what to do when the command is false. We can now modify that to include the else. And once again, please bear in mind that the spacing is important. So the if statement also makes use of the indentation. So on line 11, I'm pressing a tab so that the print can be lined up properly. So all the statements which are associated with each of the if options, they have to be indented. So they are equal. So if num1 is not equal to num2, then we are going to print they are not equal. However, if this statement is false, then we'll move to the else, meaning the values would be equal. So let's test that out. All right, so the else has a syntax error. And as it says right here, we are expected to have the colon, just like how we have the colon up here at the if. So it's else colon, and then we re-execute. So they are not equal. And if we set them to be equal, let's say we put both of them to be 20, Then it now says they are equal. So this is how we execute the if else. So first of all, we check to see if they are not equal. And if they are not, we print the message indicating that they are not equal. But if this is false, then it means that they would be equal. And so it means that we would be at the else and we would print the they are equal message. Having said that, there are more than one ways to write programs, and I particularly do not like this kind of logic because it just seems a bit harder to understand. So what I'm going to do, I've already shown you how to use the not equal command. I'm going to go back to the equal. And I'm saying if they are equal, if they match, then let's print equal. Otherwise, let's print they are not equal. So the changes are going to be make the program execute the same way as it did before. However, I think that writing it this way is easier to understand and comprehend. So if they are equal, we print they are equal. Let's try that. So they are equal. But if we change it, then it means that this is false, which means that they are not equal. So we would jump to the else and we would print out the message they are not equal. So let's try that. They are not equal because 10 is not equal to 20. So that takes care of the double if. So we now have the if else. But remember, we can also have if else if. Oh, by the way, before I go to the if else if, just to indicate, we can have multiple statements associated with each criteria. So I could have another print statement here. Let's print my first name, Harriet. And down here, let's put another print statement. And let's put my last name, which is Scarlett. And what we're saying here is that if num1 is equal to num2, then we're going to print these two lines. Notice we have indented both lines. And that's what I wanted to point out. So let's have a look, just executing. They are not equal. And then Scarlett is printed, which means 10 and 2 are not equal. So the condition up here fails, which means we jump to the else. And now we're printing they are not equal and we print Scarlett. And if it is that they are equal, so we assign num2 to be 10 as well, then it means that we're now going to be right here because the two numbers would be equal. So we're going to print they are equal. And then I'm printing my first name, Harry. So we can now jump to the if else if. In order to use the if else if, we can have multiple criteria or condition that we want to check. So we use the elif command, ELIF, and we're going to now specify the criteria that we want to check against. So we are checking to see if num1 is not equal to num2. And if it is, if that statement is true, then we are going to put the print statements there. Otherwise, we have a print statement. That's where we're going to say comparison not done. So in essence, what we're doing, we're checking for equality, or we're checking if they are not equal. We're printing the appropriate messages in either case. And if there's anything else, we're going to say comparison is not done. For those of you who are astute, you would quickly realize that we will not reach down here. Because if the values are equal, we're going to be up here. And if they are not equal, then we're going to be down here. And there are no other cases which are necessary that would allow us to go to the else, because it's either the numbers are going to be equal or they are not going to be equal. So having tested this, we're now going to change up the comparison operators a little bit. So it's time to test. So the two numbers are equal. So we print lines 9 and 10. We're now going to change it so that they are not equal. And you are seeing here that we are printing lines 12 and 13. Let's add, instead of the not equal, let's check if it is greater than. So we want to check if num1 is greater than num2. And let's add another one. So elif, and this time we check to see if num2 is greater than num1. Please note that for the elif, we also terminate using the colons. I now need to change the statement for this one. So this says num1 greater than num2. So I'm just going to put a message that says num1 is greater. So num1 greater. And for this one, where we're checking to see if num2 is greater, then I'm going to put the message that says num2 is greater. So I just change it to num2 is greater. And let's print my full name here, just to distinguish. So if num2 is greater, we're going to print my full name. And if the comparison is not done, then we're going to say the comparison is not done. So let's check this out. So we have 10 and 20. Well, let's start with them being equal. So let's say 10 and 10. So we execute. They are equal, so we print lines 9 and 10. We now want to check if num1 is greater than num2. So let's say num1 is 20 and num2 is 10. So let's test that. So we now get num1 is greater. And we print scarlet, so lines 12 and 13. Let's now check if num2 is greater. So if num2 is greater, then we want num2 to be 20. And we want num1 to be 10. And let's execute that. Note we are now printing lines 15 and 16 because num2 is now greater. And we are printing the full name, Horrit Scarlet. And let's now see if we can generate the else statement. So the else statement says the comparison was not done. So we would have checked to see if num1 is greater than num2. We would have also checked to see if num2 is greater than num1. So let's comment out this check. So here we have num2 being greater than num1, but we're not doing the checks. We're going to execute. And now that we see that we end up with a message that says the comparison was not done. So we have effectively shown how to set up the if statements, and we have looked at the single if. We have looked at the double if. And we have also looked at the multiple if by including the if, else if construct. Important to bear in mind that for each of the if statements and also the else statement or the else keyword, we have to put the semicolon that indicates we are at the end. Next thing that you need to bear in mind, once the command has a if in it, so if or elif, then there has to be a condition there that has to be checked to see if the condition is, or if the condition is false. So we have completed what we want to complete in terms of the if statements. And it's now time for us to move over into the loop statements. So remember, the loop allows us to do things over and over. And I'm going to set up a loop here. So let's say 4, and I'm going to change num1 to, let's say, 5. For I, that's just a variable in, and the range is going to be, let's say, 5. I'll do it this way first. Put a colon at the end. We're going to indent under it because the for works just like the if, where the statements that are associated with the for, they have to be indented. And for the print, I'm just going to print the value of I. And this is going to be instructive, so please pay special attention here. I'm going to execute. And notice I get values ranging from 0 to 4. So by default, the range command is going to start at 0. And by default, once we give it a number, it's going to stop right before that number. So it means that the number that precedes 5 is 4. So we're going to run from 0 to 4, which means that we are looping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. We could have been explicit by putting the starting point. So let's say 0, 5. And if we execute this, you realize that we get the same thing. So you might want to use this syntax because it's easier to comprehend. So the 0 indicates where we start. So we start at 0. And the 5 indicates that we're going to stop at 1 before we reach that number. So if this number is 5, it means we're going to stop at 4. If this number was 10, then it means we're going to stop at 9. So I put that to 10. We re-execute. So note, we get from 0 to 9. So that's how the range works. Just to indicate, though, that I could have replaced these values with variables and we would still be good in terms of numeric variables. So this is saying we start at 0 and num1 is 5. So it means that we're going to end at 4. So let's re-execute. And you are seeing that we get 0 to 4. And once again, just to show that we can have multiple statements associated with the for. So in addition to printing 0 to 4, we also want to print apple that number of times. So let's execute. So this is 0, then apple 1, then apple 2, then apple 3, then apple 4, then apple. So we are executing both of these statements within the single for loop. Now, once you comprehend the for, then remember that we have some additional loops as well. And in particular, let me just quickly look at the while. So I'm going to find the syntax for the Python while. And here is the syntax. It is while. Then we have the condition. Please note that the condition ends with the colon. And remember, if we're setting up the while so that it works like a for loop, then it means that we now need to increment or decrement, and also we need to place that incrementation or decrementation within the loop. So I'm going to rewrite this loop, but instead we are going to make use of the while command. So it's while, and now I need to determine where my starting and ending point is going to be. So I'm going to say while I is less than num1. And in the loop, I'm going to print the value of I. And above that, I'm going to initialize I to be 0. So what we're doing is we're trying to duplicate this entire loop here. The starting point is 0 for I. So I is going to be 0 here. The ending point is going to be whatever is in num1, which is 5. So I'm going to say while I is less than num1. Because remember, we want to stop at 4, not at 5. And then we're going to print I. And inside the loop, we have to now do the increment. So I is equal to I plus 1. And remember, when we did the first, let me do this quickly, just to demonstrate. So we're going back to the first for. We get 0 to 4 being printed. So we're now going to comment out that for and activate the while. And we are going to re-execute. And once again, we get 0 to 4 being printed. So it means that both loops are doing the same thing, even though we have implemented them in different ways. So that's how the while loop can work if it is that we are setting it up for a counter control loop or a definite loop. But what if we wanted to set up an indefinite loop? I remember the definition of the indefinite loop. So the definition of the indefinite loop is a loop that we know it will end, but we are not sure when it will end in terms of how many times it's going to loop before it actually ends. So we're going to simulate that here by making use of the while. So let's say while response is equal to 1. And we're going to print, let's say loop entered. And what we want to do here is that whenever response is not equal to 1, then we want to terminate the loop. So let's create response outside. And let's put response equal to 1 so that we are sure that we enter the loop. And inside the loop, having said that the loop has been entered, we're now going to prompt the user enter a response. And we're going to store that value inside the response variable. And we are going to convert this to an integer. And the reason for that is, remember that whenever we get a value from the input statement, that value is stored as a string. But response here and response here is being viewed as an integer. So I want to convert the response. So notice I'm wrapping the entire response command inside the int command that we had looked at earlier. And what the int command does, as we mentioned, it turns a string numeric into its numeric. So let's try this out quickly. So we have entered the loop, and then it says enter a response. Remember, if we enter 1, then we will continue. So loop entered again, we enter 1, we continue. Let's say we now enter 2, then now we end. Let's make this clearer by putting a colon here and a space so that we can separate the input from the prompt. And let's also go to the end. So notice this print statement now is not being indented. And what this means is that it's now not inside the loop. So I'm now going to print a message that says outside of the loop. Or maybe it should be loop has ended. So whenever this message executes, then we know that we have left the loop. So let's run again and test this out. So response was 1. So we know that we would have entered the loop. So the loop was entered. It's now waiting on a response. And for the response, we are going to put 1. So we want to re-enter the loop again, which happened. We are still awaiting a new response. So we now say 2, which means that we now want to exit the loop. We hit enter. And now note it says outside of the loop has ended, which means we have reached this statement. And this statement is not indented, so we know that this statement is not inside the loop. And just to wrap things up now, nicely, in this case, we had determined or predetermined what the response would have been so that we enter the loop. But what if we wanted to give that option to the user? So the user decides if they want to enter the loop any at all at the beginning. Then what we can do is get rid of that hard-coded value, and we can take our response variable with our input, and we can now allow the user to determine whether or not they want to enter the loop and when to end. Let's run this. Notice it now says enter a response before we even enter the loop. So if it is that I put a 2 now and I hit enter, notice we are now outside of the loop, which means we would not have even entered the loop, because if we had entered the loop, we would have seen the statement loop entered being printed. So we are going to re-execute and try another option. We'll try 1 first so that we can enter the loop. So we have entered the loop, asking for another response. Let's re-enter the loop 1 more time with another 1. And now let's end the loop. And by the way, we could have ended the loop with anything apart from 1, because the response says, the code says, while response is equal to 1, then we enter the loop, which means anything else apart from 1 would now exit the loop. So if I enter -5, for example, notice the loop has ended. We're now outside of the loop. So we have now covered the essentials in terms of the control structures that we need in terms of the if statements and in terms of the loop. And in our next session, we will now look at classes and how to set up classes in Python. Once again, please remember that we are building on the concepts that you would have learned already inside C++. So please ensure that you are watching the full gamut of the recordings. And as you watch, it is important that you actually practice at the same time so that you can get a deeper understanding or appreciation of what is happening. So you can become a very, very good developer. See you in the next session.